Welcome to the first lecture on probability and statistics. We'll start with some basic terms in this lecture. The first term that we will study is variable. A variable is a characteristic that varies over time or varies over observations. The term variable comes from vary, V-A-R-Y, V-A-R-Y. This means to vary, to change. So something that changes over time or that changes from one observation to another, we call it variable. For example, the temperature of different persons noted in a classroom. For example, in your class, if we note temperatures of different students, these are persons or students numbered from 1 to 10, and these are the temperature values recorded for all these students. And we see that they are different. So this is variable. This temperature observation, this temperature is a variable, has different values that varies from observation to observation or from one person to another. These are graphically, I have represented these 10 persons here. So this is what a variable is in probability and statistics. The next thing is experimental unit. The experimental unit is individual or object on which a variable is measured. In this example, in our last example, persons are experimental units. This is one experimental unit, person number one. This is another. This is yet another. So we have these experimental units, right? And we measure different one variable or more than one variables versus every experimental unit, right? The next term is population. It's a very famous term in probability and statistics. This refers to the set of all measurements of interested, but the measurements are taken on all possible individuals or for all possible experimental units. If suppose we have a set of all undergraduate students in Pakistan, the ages, if we compute age, or sorry, if we record age of every undergraduate student in Pakistan, that will be a population. But that would of course be difficult to record, but that is population. Whereas sample is the subset of population. It is a subset of measurement made on population. For example, ages, instead of recording ages of all undergraduate students, if we record ages in one university, for example, in your university, that will be a small part of this population, the ages of all undergraduate students in Pakistan. This measurement taken on in your university would be a subset of that, and that subset is called sample. So population refers to measurements taken on each and every observation, on each and every experimental unit, whereas sample is, generally speaking, it's a subset of the population. So sample, graphically speaking, sample is a small part of the population. So taking observations or recording variables versus each and every individual given in this population is difficult, or it is sometimes impossible. So therefore, most of the times we have to rely on samples, right? The next thing that we have to study is data. It is measurements made on a set of experimental units. For example, we have these experimental units of students, 1, 2, 3. These are experimental units. So for this first experimental unit, I record data for the student's GPA, its gender, its year, whether he or she is in first or second or third year, or the major subject that he or she is studying at a university. So measurements made on on 5 different experimental units are given in this table. So we record observations. So this is one variable versus for what is one variable for this data. We call it GPA. It's a variable. Gender is another variable. Year is a variable, and major is also a variable because the values for all these 4 variables, they vary from person to person. So this is what we studied for variable, that the value varies from with respect to time or with respect to individuals, right? So we have in this data table, we have 4 variables: GPA, gender, geo, and major. And the student numbers, they are experimental units, right? So we have univariate, bivariate, and multivariate data as the last thing to study in this lecture. Univariate study data, this means when a single variable is measured on a single experimental unit. For one experimental unit, for example, for person number 1 in this example, for person number 1, this is one experimental unit, I record only one variable, for example, temperature. If I do that, this data is univariate. The term uni, you know that the term uni means, you all know uni means one. Uni means one. So univariate data means that for one experimental unit, one, for example, one, we record only one observation, for example, temperature. For 2, we record the same observation. So we have only one variable recorded, the value of one variable is recorded versus each experimental unit. The other type of data is bivariate, where we record 2 variables per experimental unit. For example, in this case, for person number 1, this is one experimental unit, we record 2 values of 2 variables. One of those variables is temperature, the other is the body weight of the student. So the temperature and body weight. Now we have 2 variables recorded versus each person. So each person, this one is an experimental unit. For one experimental unit, we record the values of 2 variables. Similarly, for 2, we record 2. For 3, we record 2, and so on. So this kind of data is bivariate. We all know that bi means, what does bi mean? Bi means 2. So we record versus each observation, we record values of 2 variables, or versus one experimental unit, this or this, we record 2 variables. That is why we call it bivariate, because these variables are 2. But if they are 3 or more than 3, what should we call it? If they are more than 2, they are 3 or 4 or 5, what should we call it? Then we'll give it a generic name, a general name. We call it multivariate data. Multi means, we know, multi means many. Multi means many. If we have many variables recorded versus each experimental unit, we call it multivariate data. For example, we have a student in the same graph that we studied in last, that we have studied earlier in this lecture. Sorry, this table. This table is the same. This is the same table. I have once again written a part of it here. This is an example. This is an example of a multivariate data. Why? Because versus each experimental unit, 1 or 2 or 3, we record variables. How many variables? 1, 2, 3, 4. We record more than 2 variables. We record, in fact, 4 variables versus each experimental unit. Therefore, we call it multivariate data. Right, that's all for this lecture, and in the next lecture we'll talk about the types of variables. Thank you.